one thing. In 1979, which is a rare thing to do for the United States government, unlike in Europe and in Turkey, the government is involved in healthcare. In the United States, it's not very much the case. But this Belmont report from 1979 was very important because it said one very important thing, that innovation and safety, they do not need to be antagonists, meaning you can do innovation and you can still be safe. That's all I'm going to say about innovation, and the rest is all going to be about bandwagons. So the word bandwagon is actually a wagon, with horses. Today they don't have horses anymore, and with a band on top. This is coming from Carnival, which is very popular in Brazil, in some other countries. So the word bandwagons comes from there. But then it has been used as a bandwagon effect. And it is not my making, as you can see. This is Dr. Leighton Rickers, who several years ago, I'm talking of over 20 years ago, wrote this editorial about the bandwagon effect in surgery. In fact, the bandwagon effect exists also in economics and in other fields. So what is it? It is the acceptance of something or of an idea that is popular, but is not proven. And the desire to be conforming to somebody who is fashionable, to be famous. The psychology of bandwagon, this is Gachabayev is one of my residents. We wrote about this because, it's very typical that you don't do critical thinking. So you don't think yourself critically. You just accept others people's judgment. Or you wish to be conformed with the majority. Or you want to be around the winner. These are the psychology. Now, the objectives of my talk today are 4. There are historical bandwagons in general surgery. I want to try to tell you how you can figure out that something is not innovation, but it's a bandwagon. I want to say something about the 4 current bandwagons in colorectal surgery and describe, what to do, to avoid being involved in a bandwagon. In general surgery, we remember phlebotomy from the 1700s, lobotomy of the brain, tonsillectomy, and mastectomy. So how do you identify bandwagon? So the bandwagon is offer a too easy one-size-fits-all solution, if you know what I mean, this expression, for a very complex clinical problem like rectal cancer, perforated diverticulitis, something very serious. The second is a very important point. Nobody else is able to reproduce the same results. And you will see that, over and over. In each bandwagon, there is one guy in some country that's going to claim that he achieved magic results, but nobody else can. And that's different between art and science. And I don't know if you understand this expression, zeitgeist is German, but it means that you are within the fashion. In English, I would say probably fashion. And homo ludens in Latin means the plain man. So, there is a component of fun, in surgery. You like to do an operation, I don't know, the robot, whatever. It's fun. So I just want to talk about 4 serious, issues in colorectal surgery that probably have opened the door to one size fits all, results. Methodology. So we all know that we do a lot of Hartmann's procedures for perforated diverticulitis with fecal, particularly fecal or or peritonitis in 4 quadrants. And you remember this laparoscopic lavage came up, I think it came from Ireland. And then we have the issue of obstructed defecation, after rectopexy for prolapse, basically, difficulty, with constipation. And we have this ventral, and I put it in quotes because it's not really ventral. I'll tell you in a minute. And then we have the claim that the recession margins, the distal margin or the circumferential margin is not easy to achieve, in obese males with a narrow pelvis or even with a bulky, mesorectum. And we have the transcendental TME. And then the last one is the idea of preserving the rectum for rectal cancer surgery, because, after surgery, you can have the LAR syndrome, you can have impotence, and retrograde ejaculation and everything. So let's start with peritonitis. Now, this, you know that in the over 100 years ago, they were doing the 3-stage operation with, colostomy and then reversal, et cetera, et cetera. But in 1996, this solution came up that you can just wash it out and the patient will be just great. And none of these people in Ireland, they quoted that basically this lavage was already being done, of course not laparoscopically, 100 years before. If you look at the so-called science, so randomized control trials from the Netherlands was a disaster, with 20% of abscess formation. And basically the IRB means ethical committee, terminated the trial because of the high morbidity and mortality in the lavage group. There was another trial from Norway that ended up the same. Basically, these findings do not support lavage, but poor patients were submitted to this. And this was my comment in disease of the coronary rectum, and that is that it's very easy to consent a patient who is in distress, telling him that I'm going to do an operation, but you're not going to have a colostomy. The patient is going to sign up right away, but he doesn't understand what he's getting himself into because he doesn't have the education to understand the consequences. But I want to talk about something else. I've been doing this study, which was published this year in Langenbeck's with my team, and we found out that how many cancers are actually washed out.
You could see him
with laparoscopic lavage, and we found out that the percentage of cancer, colon cancer, perforated colon cancer, can go up to 11%. For an average of 7.2. So that's cancer. Number 2, more important, is that the diagnosis of having laparoscopically washed out a perforated cancer rather than perforated diverticulitis, the delay to find out about that it actually was a cancer is on average 2 months up to 5 months. Let's change subject. The second bandwagon, the so-called quote-unquote ventral rectopexy. So historically, we know that we have been doing posterior rectopexy, even in old times, even to the psoas muscle before it came, it became available to the sacrum. Most famous is Cutai from Brazil. But also the so-called ventral rectopexy existed, and it was described by Lois David in 1949 and by certain Deutscher, who was a Swiss, it's a Swiss surgeon. You can see his technique here. So this was ventral because ventral means that it was attached to the pubis, to the pubic bone. But again, none of the promoter of the laparoscopic ventral X-ray ever quoted, the original articles. So all these papers that I'm quoting here are essentially bandwagons because they are all excellent results. Actually, you can do it in people that are 80 years old rather than do a Delorme or an Altemeyer. This is great, fantastic. All bandwagons. One more thing that I want the young surgeon, I want to remind the young surgeon is that the claim that posterior mobilization will lead to constipation is completely wrong because the sympathetic nerves that are depicted here, that are supplying the wall of the rectum, as you can see here, they are actually inhibitory. So if you ever injure one of these nerves, you're not going to do anything wrong for constipation. Constipation would be caused by something else. This thing became so bad that the government of Scotland basically put a moratorium on the use of mesh, because the mesh would be eroding in the posterior wall of the vagina with the consequences that you can just imagine. Finally, we had a Danish study that was, randomized, that was seriously well done, and then concluded the ventral rectopexy is not superior to posterior rectopexy in terms of, how much constipation or obstructed defecation, you can have 1 year later. So all this claim about ventral rectopexy, which is not ventral, by the way, being superior was really eliminated by a well-conducted study rather than, the retrospective, bandwagons. Now we get into something worse because we're talking of a very serious disease, rectal cancer. The first bandwagon is transaminase TME. This is a Norwegian newspaper, one of the most important, newspapers in Norway. It does say here in Norwegian, I used to work in Norway for some of my Turkish friends, they remember when I was coming to Turkey from Norway. And so I can still speak and read, and they say that the patient died. We got to stop this new method, and they're referring to transaminase TME. So about 10 years ago, I wrote this editorial in colorectal disease when I wanted to understand what was the reason why to start this. So I look at this paper from Antonio Lacey that basically was comparing short-term outcomes. And I realized that his claim that the distal margin was longer with transaminase TME, 2.8, basically means that he was doing an unnecessary low transaction, basically removing the entire rectum, people that didn't need to have the whole rectum removed. Because as you know, all you need of distal margin is 1 centimeter. You don't need more than 1 centimeter. So, and the function, and the complications of removing the whole rectum is completely unacceptable. The second one was another study from Eric Roulier from France. They claimed to have, in Annals of Surgery, they claimed to be randomized, and he was never randomized because he claimed to have randomized the first patient in 2008 when transaminase TME wasn't even existing. Then we have this study from Jaap Bongel from the Netherlands. They was again claiming advantage in the quality of the TME. And if you're not a novice and you can read articles critically, you can understand that the p-value was calculated including APR, abdominal perineal resection or excision, as you want to call it. And everybody knows that abdominal perineal excision doesn't have anything to do with the TME quality. So anyway, then we go over to recruitment biases. Basically, this is the international registry where they essentially recruited female patients which notoriously had a very easy wide pelvis, so no reason to do a transvaginal TME. And they were operating on transvaginal TME, meaning removing the entire rectum down to the anal verge for people that had a cancer at 13 centimeters from the anal verge. When I wrote this letter to them, they responded they needed to train to get better. So they were using females and high cancer just to learn the technique on human beings. I also have been publishing a critical review on something called NEMA's bias. Basically, in a voluntary, if you can see here, it's very important to understand, this is a voluntary database. In a voluntary database, unlike in a mandatory database, you can enter any patient you like, but the patient that you don't want to enter, you don't enter them. So basically, you select the patient that you want to register. And there is more. I don't know if you know McNamara fallacy. McNamara was an officer in the United States government at the time of the Vietnam War, and his fallacy, meaning his mistakes, became famous because he was claiming that the United States was winning the war in Vietnam, counting the number of killed Vietnamese soldiers, which is not the way you measure the success of a war. And again, here, they did the same. So they were claiming great results, and I found out they were counting 40% of the dead patients as recurrence-free in order to, mask the, in order to fall to the rate of recurrence. Also, the Concorde fallacy is another concept that comes from the airplane, from the French airplane Concorde, that was basically noticeable that there was no future for the Concorde airplane. And still some people, they keep going. This is my last work on transvaginal TME, published in Diseases of the Colon and Rectum, where I had the honor to be with Dr. Wasmund from Norway, Abe Fingerhut, and Dr. Les Bouquet from Australia. And we looked at some 1,000 patients that were in the literature, and the methodology was essentially terrible. So we couldn't really conclude that this value of 3.4 at 20 months was credible. The last part of my talk is about watch and wait. It's also, as you know, about rectal cancer. So very, very recently, a month ago, actually, in September 2024, Dr. Wasmund, again, the same Norwegian doctor who was promoting the moratorium against transvaginal TME and the Norwegian government stopped transvaginal TME. They reported on a study called Norwait. It's a Norwegian study on watch and wait. I summarize for you the results in this slide. So in 5 years of 82 cases, Norway is a small country with 4 or 5 million people. They have 53% local recurrence. They have 40% metastasis and 23% death rate. Now, if you go back in time, 20 years, this is a study from Sloan Kettering Memorial. It's a very famous cancer center in Manhattan, New York. They basically calculated that if you operate all these patients after you give them neoadjuvant chemoradiation, in the specimen, in the clinic, you find out that you have 19% of so-called clinical complete response. But when you operate on all of them, you find out that of this 19% that you thought had clinical complete response, actually 75% has tumor foci, meaning cancer cells, in the rectal wall, and only 25% of the 19% had a pathological complete response. So 25% of 19% of almost 500 patients. This is lung catering. These authors from England, they basically they did a review. This is back over 10 years ago. And they concluded that of the 18 studies from one author only, Bergama in Brazil, and 12 studies from elsewhere in the world, the studies, the results from Brazil were not reproducible by any other. And that the proof of concept in small rectal cancer, cases which were the Brazilian, cases were early cancers, was uncritically, extrapolated and applied to locally advanced rectal cancer. I go on and on to say that, this author in colorectal disease expressed the opinion of British Irish specialists, saying that there were over 70 different combinations of what investigation you should do to define clinical complete response, basically with some irony. Now, this article is from Paris, the Saint Antoine Hospital in Paris, and they pointed out something very important. Regardless of this controversy about pathological and clinical complete response, even if you have pathological complete response, you have at least 7% metastasis in the lymph nodes or 46% metastasis in the lymph nodes, depending on the staging of the cancer, of course. So we spoke earlier about voluntary registry as opposed to mandatory. And in this voluntary registry, there were a lot of biases, but the most important bias they want to is number 3. So the decision to define what is clinical complete response was left to the center. So basically, all these centers were including cases in the registry, but every center had its own definition of complete clinical response. Imagine the validity of this registry. I want to mention one study. It's called OPERA from Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in Manhattan, New York, which was very well criticized by a group of Turkish medical oncologists, Sut Kuglu, and his co-authors in the Journal of Clinical Oncology in last year. Basically, the Turkish medical oncologist said that this study from New York didn't even define near complete response, and they didn't even quote how many cases of near complete clinical complete response they were merged together with clinical complete response. And they claim in New York they have 75%, imagine, 75% complete clinical response. Unbelievable. And then in order to inflate the survival rate, the disease-free survival rate, they excluded, basically non-counted or excluded 33% of local recurrence cases. So I'm really very happy about this, having read this article from the Turkish medical oncologist. Now, there are some good news for the future, and that is called diffusion-weighted imaging with apparent diffusion coefficient. Very difficult to remember, but it's a type of MRI that is going to completely blow away the old-fashioned T2-weighted MRI. Because this kind of MRI is going to be quantitative, meaning that instead of allowing the radiologist to tell you his interpretation of the image, he will giving us numbers. So this might be a breakthrough in the future if you want to pursue watch and wait. And for example, an example is the MRI split scar sign. I don't gonna go too much into it, but you need to know about these radiology papers, from last year. Now, one thing is gonna change everything for watch and wait is this study. This is a study that shows that you don't need to do radiation, for a local advanced rectal cancer preoperatively. You can just do chemotherapy. And as you know, radiation has been a very important fundamental of watch and wait. So preoperative FOLFOX is not inferior to preoperative chemoradiation in regard to disease-free survival. So to conclude on watch and wait, I want to say that in my opinion, clinical complete response is nothing more than a mucosal complete response. If this new imaging that I showed you briefly, the quantitative MRI, will become available, it might help reducing the discourses between clinical complete response, or mucosal, if you want to call it, and pathologic complete response. And then remember that it's very easy to consent the patients to no surgery rather than consenting a patient to undergo rectal cancer surgery. So in conclusion, regarding bandwagons, you need to be considering alternative views. You need to think critically and be independent, have an independent voice, and then look at the evidence. Don't believe if things have health value, and don't care about the discomfort of changing practice, and be very careful if there is little or no evidence. And remember that knowledge is only going up incrementally. You can have a magic solution like we have seen some people claim. And if you think this is a bandwagon, don't get involved and call it for what it is. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions.